ICYF model OIC is a simulation of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC. It's similar to the UN model. Model OIC is a very unique training program. It was adopted by the third session of the Islamic Conference of Youth and Sports Ministers held in October 2016 in Istanbul. And also it was approved by the 43rd session of the OIC Council of Foreign Ministers held in October 2016 in Tashkent. ICYF model OIC seeks to educate young participants on the current trends of international relations, effective communications, and multilateral diplomacy. In this program, we are very fortunate to have with us selected 120 young diplomats, young leaders, and representatives. 50 of them are females and 70 are males. They are participants from 50 different OIC member states and non-OIC member states. Today, we have a very distinguished speaker with us, Her Excellency Dr. Azza Karam, the Secretary General-elect of Religious for Peace International, and the Professor of Religion and Development at Vrije University. Vrije, I mean, it's a Dutch, I think I'm spelling this right, Vrije University in Amsterdam, Netherlands. Dr. Azza previously served as the Senior Advisor on Culture at the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, and also as a coordinator and chair of the United Nations Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development. She also served as the Senior Policy Research Advisor at the United Nations Development Program in the Regional Bureau for Arab States, the President of the Committee of Religious NGOs at the United Nations. She is also the lead facilitator for the United Nations Strategic Learning Exchange on Religion, Development, and Diplomacy, building on a legacy of serving as a trainer and facilitator of intercultural leadership and management in the Arab region, as well as in Europe and Central Asia. Today, as I said, we are very fortunate to have with us a speaker with very diverse backgrounds, experiences. Her Excellency Dr. Azza will speak to us about the impact of the pandemic on the humanitarian and social challenges, critical questions, and lessons. So dear participants, please to have a very effective session with this great speaker, we request you to keep your microphones muted, raise your hands when you are interested to speak or raise your question. And also you might wish to use the chat box to write your questions clearly so we can ask if we finish with the raised hands. We will also would like to accommodate, inshallah, we'll try to accommodate all your questions and feedback as much as Dr. Azza can bear with us today. So dear friend, Dr. Karam, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Fadila. It is such a pleasure to see you, and it is an honor for me to be invited by you and your organization here today. And so I give my deep thanks to Dr. Taha, to yourself, and to the colleagues who are managing this entire process. I am particularly thrilled to be able to be with you all, to see all your faces here today. The honor is actually incredibly mine because I have participated in former Model UN sessions before with many different organizations. So it's always such a joy to know, and I did not know that OIC and yourselves had this. So it's such a pleasure to be able to join you for this. I have a PowerPoint presentation, which I'm not asking for yet, but because I wanted to just let the colleagues here know that I will speak specifically from the angle or from the perspective of working with different religious institutions and religious organizations. So I will be talking obviously about the social implications, but specifically through the vantage point or the insight of what's happening in the world or the realms of religions at large. So to justify why this will be the particular angle that I am choosing to speak from, it's because obviously I head an organization that works with religious communities around the world, just as the United Nations has member governments, member states. Religions for Peace, my organization, has member religious institutions. In other words, the Vatican, Al-Azhar, similar kinds of religious institutions, their representatives are constituting religions for peace. So if you wanted to understand what Religions for Peace is, think of it as the United Nations of the religious institutions and religious communities around the world. So on my board, just like in the UN General Assembly, you have 193 governments. On my board, I have 65 religious institutions and organizations around the world represented. So what and how, and thank you very much for putting on, there you go. Next slide, please. To give you an idea of the just very quickly, an idea of the structure, you can put the next slide, please. Okay, doesn't matter. One of the functions that you see, just like you have the UN General Assembly and the Security Council, in our entity, Religions for Peace, we have the World Council and an executive committee. The executive committee decides on behalf of this global movement. Just as in the United Nations, you have the main headquarter entity and a number of different country and regional entities. In Religions for Peace as well, we have regional offices as well as national level offices. In the regional office, it is a structure that is, there you go, it's the regional or denominational bodies. This gives you an idea, a little bit of what it looks like. Within the World Council, which you can think of as the General Assembly, within the World Council, we have representation from all the different religious institutions of the world. We have regional offices, and you can see that there's Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, North America, Africa, Middle East, as well as Europe. Each of these regional entities has the religious institutions in the region represented, and then they oversee national level interreligious councils, or IRCs we call them, interreligious councils. An interreligious council is exactly that. It is a council of religious leaders from around the world, from around this particular context at the national level, who sit on this structure called the regional or the national interreligious council structure. But it's not just religious leaders. So at all levels, global, regional, you can put the next slide, please. At all the levels, whether global or regional or national, we also have youth networks, interreligious youth networks, and interreligious women's networks. So the women members who work in these different religious institutions and organizations, in addition to youth members. So in every country, there is an interreligious youth network and an interreligious women's network that is part of the Interreligious Council. Okay, next slide, please. We have, in December of this year, we convened 300 religious leaders, men and women, mostly men, but also with the youth and the women's networks from around the world to decide on the organization's new strategic direction for the next 5 years, inshallah. So they decided amongst themselves on these 6 strategic priorities. Now, what is interesting about these priorities is that for the first time in the 50-year existence of Religions for Peace, the language of the priorities of the organization is almost identical to the Sustainable Development Goals, language and priorities. So gender equality, for instance, is a priority adopted by all these religious leaders, which, by the way, is absolutely historic. Because usually religious leaders, when they come together, don't necessarily agree that gender equality is something that they would be willing to work for together. To have had them agree to this is an enormous shift in mindset. And it shows you that in spite of the challenges that we hear often about women and women's rights in religious communities, it shows you that when you can convene the religious leaders and institutions with the women and the young people together, there's another dynamic to that form of exchange, that form of existence, that form of reality. There's a totally different dynamic, which can actually be extremely enlightening, empowering for many of these leaders in their spaces. So they agreed the gender equality, which is the same as the Sustainable Development Goals agreement. They spoke about education as one of their critical priorities, in this case, focusing on interreligious education, looking at what kind of curricula are being taught in schools and in seminaries where the religious leaders themselves are educated, to try to see how best to understand one another's religion. Sustainable environment, as you know, that's also one of the Sustainable Development Goals. Peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. This is everything to do with peace building and with the rule of law and with transitional justice issues and with mediation of conflict. All these areas come under this strategic goal. The one goal that is not found in the Sustainable Development Goals, but is very much now adopted by Religions for Peace, is the goal on freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This goal is very important for the work of the religious leaders, not because of the arguments around religious liberty, not only because of the importance of the protection of religious minorities, that is included. But please notice the language. This is the language of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 18 speaks of freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. This is not the same as religious freedom per se. Why? Because in this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18 articulation, this is about the simultaneity of the freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, and freedom of religion. You cannot have one without the other. What some governments in some parts of the world have decided to prioritize is they've selected the freedom of religion as a unique strategic goal. What the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has systematically maintained, however, is that in order to defend freedom of religion, you must be champions of the freedom of thought and the freedom of conscience, which means you must defend those who have no religion. You must defend those who have a difference of opinion. You must defend those who have a different feeling and understanding about how they should live their lives. You have to defend freedoms. So this article is often misinterpreted as freedom of religion or religious liberty per certain government agendas. But in Religions for Peace, the commitment, the dedication is identical to that of the United Nations and identical to that from the human rights agenda, which is that you have to be, as religious leaders, you have to champion all freedoms in this particular space. Next slide, please. So, how is it that this world of religious leaders, youth, and women, how is it that this world of interreligious collaboration has responded to the COVID crisis? Important for you to know a few basic facts, which are not here on this particular PowerPoint. Important possibly for you to know that on an average day-to-day existence, 30% of social services, health, education, nutrition, sanitation, social services around the world, 30% is often provided by or through religious institutions. And that's a conservative estimate. In situations of humanitarian crises, this figure can rise to 70%. What are we talking about? Think very practically what's going on now with the health services around the world. Ministries of health in countries which are deeply impacted by the COVID disaster are running the hospitals and the clinics that come under the Ministry of Health's administration. In truth, the higher the degree of impact of COVID, the less the ability of the government-run healthcare services to cope, because they are overrun. They do not have sufficient facilities. So what happens is they go to the wider network of health service providers. Now, factually, at least 30% of those health service providers are actually faith-based or faith-run entities. The Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, mosques, synagogues, temples run their own health institutions. In situations of crises, because the government-run health services often cannot cope, they will go to these faith or religiously provided health institutions. Even here in the United States, in New York, the financial capital of the world, at the height of the COVID disaster, they needed to open additional health centers to cope with the numbers of people who required care who were impacted by COVID. Do you know what they did? I don't know if any of you have heard of Central Park, New York Central Park. You might have seen it in a couple of movies. Central Park in New York City, they had to set up a big tent in the middle of Central Park in order to accommodate the overflow from the hospitals, not just the government-run hospitals, the private-run hospitals. The ones who set up this additional mega tent to accommodate the overflow of COVID patients were faith-based organizations. Samaritan's Purse, to be precise. In Geneva, the most beautiful capital city of Europe, in Geneva, Caritas, which is a Catholic charity, the largest in the world, feeds, at one point it was feeding 5,000 people in Switzerland per day. Caritas, Switzerland, the secular space in the universe. The point here is religious institutions don't have an option. In fact, in times of crises, they are anyway at the forefront of what needs to be supported and provided. So this is just a background fact for all of you, in case you're interested in why would we look at the social impact through religions? Well, you would have to look at the social impact through religions because religious institutions are the basic providers of basic social services, at least a third of them under normal circumstances all over the world. So if you want to talk about social impact, look at those providing the social services and you realize, oh my goodness, that's a significant number of religiously run social service providers around the world. Okay, from rich to not so rich to really not very rich at all. Okay, this is the normal around the world. So it is with a view to that very real data, figure, etc. And by the way, we're only talking about health. If you now start talking about education, just as one very, very, very tiny example, I am an Egyptian, I am a Muslim, I went to Catholic school in Egypt because it was a very good school. And most of my friends and family went to Catholic schools because they were very good schools. So we actually do not have a proper estimate of how many religiously run schools there are in the world, but I would wager you as a conservative estimate is that we at least 20% of basic educational services around the world are also provided through religious institutions. And I think many of you know this, you would have come across it. Unfortunately, in the Muslim context, we only hear of the negativity of the madrasas, but we know very well that there are many schools that are where the instruction, where the management is provided through different religious institutions. So if we look at the rest of the social service scale, we're only looking at health here. But if we start looking at the other areas, education, for instance, we'll find that we are talking about a very vibrant space where religious actors are providing basic needs to their communities. And this number of service providers only increases in humanitarian crises. And COVID is a global humanitarian crisis. It is not located in one part of the world, it's all over, as you all know. So you can well imagine that the religious institutions are, without having an option, are all involved in the provision of relief for and during this crisis. They're the first responders during this crisis. In 2016, the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UN OCHA, looked at the top 10 non-governmental organizations who are the top 10 humanitarian actors, service providers in the world, the top 10 in the world. Out of a list of 10, the top 4 or faith-based NGOs. This is the global average in humanitarian crises. So work backwards from that to understand why we look at the impact of the social impact and political impact of what's going on in COVID. Why are we looking at it from the perspective of religion? Because the religious institutions are actually the first responders in this humanitarian crisis. Okay? One of the things that we do in Religions for Peace, let me just take you now to Religions for Peace. Remember that the world of religions is massive, right? The Catholic Church alone is massive. We're not now talking about the Anglican churches and the other Protestant and Methodist, and we're not talking about the Muslim, we're not talking about the Hindu and the Buddhist, and the world of religions makes all of us look this tiny, if that much, okay? So let me just share with you a little bit of what Religions for Peace is trying to do in this particular COVID response space. We realized that there is a hunger for information, that many religious leaders and many religious institutions were hungry for the latest data and information about how this disease is transmitted, what they could do to prevent and to stop, what their particular role is. Indeed, many of them were wondering if they cannot have their services in their mosques and their churches anymore, what is it that they can do? What is it that they could possibly be able to Sir, how do they do religion now? What is the Jum'ah prayer going to look like if it's not going to be in the usual spaces and congregations? And we know that for a very long time, indeed, mosques and churches and synagogues and temples were shut because people were simply not allowed to congregate, even with the 6 feet apart. They were simply shut. So there's been a massive trauma that is taking place in this realm of religion. From the very basic, what is it that religions do, to how do you now conduct a prayer service when you can't have most people come into your entity? Oh, we go online. Wonderful. Go online. Is it that easy? Is it that easy to do your Jummah sermon online? Is that what we're used to? Is that what our leaders are trained to do a Jummah service online? The sermon goes online, the prayer goes online. Is that what they're trained to do? No, they're not. They're not trained to do that. That's not what comes to them naturally. It's not natural. It doesn't make sense to so many of them. So there's been a massive transition. There is a massive transition that's taking place and is causing some trauma amongst many of the religious institutions and religious leaders, because their very essence, their very job is now having to be radically reconfigured in this moment. We don't know what the impact of this will look like yet. We're still beginning to see this trauma unfold, so to speak. So need for messages, need for information, need for resource materials, but more than anything, the need for actual support. Next slide, please. So the average church in any of the communities, the average mosque, the average temple, will have an idea about the households in their community who are deeply impacted and affected. How many elderly people are being looked after? How many live alone? How many people with disabilities are being looked after? How many live alone, etc. Because COVID lockdown made it extraordinarily difficult for people who earn a day-to-day living around the world to get their day-to-day living. So people were suddenly worried not so much about COVID, they were worried about hunger. We have starvation concerns globally taking place, even here in the United States of America. There are levels of fear of starvation that is very, very real. So the basic ask that was made of all these interreligious councils and religious institutions was, how can we get an income now that we're stuck here? We can't get out. I have no access. I can't get food. I can't get food on the table. The other thing was the advocacy that we had to wash our hands as often as possible, that's a good way to try to stay safe. Some majority households in the developing world, it's impossible to do this hand washing because it's difficult enough to get water to drink. To get clean water to drink is already very difficult. So what do you mean I have to wash my hands every few minutes? With which water do I wash my hands every few minutes? The water that I need to drink? Very, very real problems and concerns. So these institutions who are now providing the health care that's required and are trying to substitute the spiritual care that people have are also busy trying to provide food packages, supplement incomes, get some money given to certain households so that they can get some food and clean water and medication for these communities. That continues to be a very real set of activities and initiatives. Then the question becomes, how do they deliver? How do they deliver the food and the packages? They need their masks. They need some protection. So I'm just giving you a quick look here at what we found our interreligious councils doing in different countries, just some examples. So it ranges from the spiritual, let's do a prayer together. Let's all come together online, of course, online, and give each other a sense of solace and comfort in knowing the divine, remembering the divine, praying to our shared divine heritage, or even praying to our different divine understandings. But let's just share this moment of prayer together. It ranges from the spiritual care, if you will, to things as basic as how do we train the religious leaders and the religious service providers on what they need to know, what kind of information they need to have, how they can get access to supplies of medicine and food and clean water. Trainings like that have been conducted and are still being conducted to many, many religious providers. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. We also realized that our interreligious councils were working with one another. So for instance, the Interreligious Council of China put together 10,000 masks to deliver to Japan, the Interreligious Council of Japan, because they realized there was a shortage of just the masks. So they delivered that. They put that together and delivered. So the interreligious councils work with one another. They work across national boundaries as well to support one another. We know that the Japan colleagues also did their own. They figured out how to make some of their own masks and share them, and protective equipment and share it. In Latin America and the Caribbean, we know that there was a specific concern for the refugees and the refugee population. So the interreligious council went to support. They made an agenda and a schedule for how they could supply the refugees who were completely outside of the radar of any government service, how to supply them with food, with water, with medicine, with shelter in some cases, to work with the other humanitarian actors to provide for the refugee and migrant needs who are impacted and affected by COVID. And this is continuing kind of work. All the way then from spiritual, interreligious services and prayers to actual provision of needed food, water, nutrition, and sanitation, to advocacy. So we realized that a number of our interreligious youth networks came together, and they were very impressed with the UN Secretary General's advocacy or call for a ceasefire. Some of you will remember that there was a very important call by the UN Secretary General to say, shame on us that we are now fighting with one another in the middle of this disaster. Can we please have a global ceasefire? Let's just ceasefire to all the different wars. Let's focus on this war with this particular enemy called the COVID. And the interreligious youth came together to issue, entirely out of their own means, entirely out of their volunteer, to issue a supportive call to their religious leaders, their political leaders, each other, their combatants, to issue a call for the ceasefire, to support the United Nations call for a ceasefire. So you can see that there's a range of different kinds of initiatives and activities that Religions for Peace, as a multi-religious UN, so to speak, has been stewarding at different levels, national, global, and regional. Next slide, please. Right. So just a few observations with you, some of the questions that I find myself and my organization struggling with. So there's no question, as I was sharing with you earlier, there's no question that religious institutions are first responders in this crisis, right? They don't really have an option. It's traditional. They will always have services to provide. Some of them are even providing their churches or synagogues or mosques for space with beds to complement the health hospitals. There's no question about that. There's no question about the fact that each religious institution and each religious community has mobilized significantly in order to provide support during this humanitarian crisis. Islamic Relief, for instance, which is one of the largest Islamic NGOs, has reported an increase in financial contributions that they have, in the money that they have, because in Ramadan and just before Ramadan and just after Ramadan, people were giving their zakat money to these different organizations. So for the first time in a long time, Islamic Relief was delighted to notice that their donations, the donations to their work, had increased significantly. Because people are giving, people who can are giving, right? So they're doing more, they're able to serve more, they're able to reach more, which is absolutely wonderful, isn't it? Same thing goes for all these different religious institutions. The Catholic charities have been serving and so on. No question that all this is happening. The question here that we have noticed, because we have to work with all religions, regardless, we work with all. The question is, to what extent are these actors, these religious, amazingly rich meaning in capacity, and not meaning in money, to what extent are these actors actually working together to serve their communities together? And this is where I can tell you with a heart full of intense sadness that they don't work together. The Catholics work as Catholics, the Protestants in their diversity work as Protestants, the Jewish organizations work as Jewish organizations, the Muslim organizations work as Muslim organizations. Yes, they serve all. They have to, in order to be credible actors, in order to have their NGO consultative status with the United Nations, they cannot discriminate based on who they serve. The truth, however, is that they do not work together. Even when Religions for Peace try to infuse, to induce, and say, we have a fund, we created a fund. We're broke, but we created a fund from the little that we have to support religious entities to work together, right? To bring their resources together, to serve their communities together. We created the fund. But you would be amazed to realize that very few have actually contributed to this fund. There is very little interreligious or multi-religious collaboration taking place. And the question then becomes, if at the height of our collective crises, everybody is impacted, everybody is affected, if at this moment of a global collective plague, our religious institutions cannot or will not collaborate, what does that tell us? What can that portend? What can that indicate about, here on the one hand, you have such a critical, major role, an expansion of the role of religious actors in the social sphere, massive expansion of their role and their presence and their existence. At the same time, they're not working together. What does that mean? What kind of an infrastructure, social fabric are we actually looking at? Stronger Catholic institutions, stronger Protestant institutions, stronger Islamic institutions, Sunnah and Shia, stronger Jewish institutions that don't work together. What kind of a social framework does that spell for us as a global community? Not only is there very little multi-religious collaboration, there is actually an incredible amount of competition. And the competition, per definition, is not leading to better services. The competition is leading to a lot of animosity, to poorer services. Some have more resources, some have less resources. And the competition requires a lot of backbiting and backstabbing and negativity about the others, and supremacy about myself. I'm better. I can do more. I can reach more. I'm much better. Competition isn't nice in a humanitarian space. It's the last thing you need out of any human organization. Competition in humanitarian context, unless you're competing to serve more people. But competition, per definition, spells political disaster. in humanitarian context. Competition between religious actors spells really, really, really bad disaster for the rest of us in this world. Those organizations that are rushing to do more because they have to, because they need to, are also not necessarily the most human rights sensitive, not necessarily caring much for human rights. Remember, a humanitarian emergency, it sounds like a luxury that you have to make sure that everybody is equally served. The human rights-based approach basically tells us, basically demands of any of us, that we have to serve all equally and make no distinction and no discrimination. We have to find those who are least able, the most vulnerable, and the most vulnerable have to be served. That's what a human rights-based approach basically says. Forget about all the big talk. A human rights-based approach is quintessentially spiritual in nature because it tells us all that we must not forget the least of us, that nobody has a right to be discriminated against, no matter who, what, where, when, and why. No one has a right to be discriminated against. That is a human rights-based approach. So here we are at a moment of great disaster for so many, where there are many who are left behind for many reasons, where the prejudices of our world are accentuated at the same time that the services are also increasing. But if without a sensitivity about human rights, who are we actually serving? Who's actually being seen and who's not being seen? So a lack of a human rights-based consciousness in this religious space is a problem, is a major problem, because it means that the prejudices that we have, we don't let go of them. We, in fact, underline them. We stress them because we're busy serving. We're busy serving. Do I have time to wonder who's nah, I'm busy. I need to get this stuff out. We got lots of people to serve here. Yes. So a human rights-based approach falls victim in a humanitarian context. And we knew this already. This we already knew. But now it's global. Now it's global. And finally, and this is just a selection of some of the concerns and some of the questions that we need to be dealing with and be conscious of. Finally, don't know if any of you noticed, but our environment appreciated the lockdown very much. Something did well. Our environment did well. Our air, the oxygen did well. So now the concern is we're back to business. Factories are back. Spewing out waste is back. Industrialization full force, because we need to make up for all this incredible calamity that has occurred to us economically and financially. We need to make up for lost time. We lost a lot. Our state of economic affairs is miserable globally. So we need to make up. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. What's going to happen to our environment now that we go full force to make up for the financial losses that we have incurred? What will we do? When we were fine and there was no global disaster, we killed our environment. We killed it very deliberately. We've lost 80% of our lung, of the nature, our nature's lung, the planet's lungs, which are the forests. We've lost 80% of the planet's lungs. What are we going to do now when we are in catch up, get the economy running, get the finance and the corporations benefiting again? What are we going to do to our environment? That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very, very much, Dr. Azza. In fact, I am following the chatting box and the people are saying she's great. So you're having with you right now 105 participants, and they're doing actually, they're very, very happy with your presentation. I was doing a summary of your presentation, but I will keep it for myself because I don't want to spend more time talking. I want you to get the chance to answer more questions, because the last thing you said, or the last part of your presentation, was about a very critical question that you raised. We noticed that to what extent are we working together? So Dr. Azza is sitting at the right place, doing the right thing, which is working for inclusive societies, inclusive religions. And for that purpose, we have her today to talk to our young people about how youth initiatives, how NGOs initiatives, how non-governmental initiatives can work together in inclusive world and can solve our problems. She laid the ground for great discussion, for great questions to come to her. And she did a beautiful job of giving us a real picture of what's going on out there, especially the pain of being chattered and not together and not able to do harmonized work together as sometimes in the religious sphere and in the non-governmental organizations. So with that, I will start with the questions. Dr. Azza, would you like me to take one by one, or you want to take three
Maybe
and then answer?
Maybe a few, and then I will answer.
Perfect. So I will start with Mr. Ahmed from Ethiopia. Mr. Ahmed.
Hello, thank you very much, Masan Asa, for your meaningful talk. I really want to ask one question, which is about the role of religious leaders on certain issues like FGM. In countries like Ethiopia, where FGM is highly widespread, what can religious leaders, what role can
Voice went off.
Mr. Ahmed, your voice is gone. So your question is clear to Dr. Azza, I believe. Let's take the second question from Mohammed Nibras from Sri Lanka.
Go ahead.
Okay, Mohammed Nibras, you have the floor.
Unmute.
Okay, go ahead. Yes, we can hear you. Mohammed Nibras, please go ahead. We can see you, we can hear you. Go ahead. Okay, looks like Mohammed has a problem. Either he cannot see us or he cannot hear us. He's not responding. Can we move to Adina Tahir from Pakistan?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I really thank you for this very amazing presentation. It was an eye-opener indeed. So I'm Adina Tahir, and my question is that we saw in countries where there was unemployment rising and economies were dying, that people were supporting right-wing policies, and we saw countries closing their borders. So right now, as COVID-19 is further causing a problem of poverty, how will you make sure that people who are more religiously inclined, they will not be against globalization anymore, and they will look towards others not as threats but as friends?
Okay, very good. Hussein Imran from Bangladesh, and then I will give the floor to Dr. Azza.
Hi, my name is Hossein Arman. I'm originally from Bangladesh, but currently living in the US. So I just would like to thank Dr. Azza Khan. It's been a fantastic talk. So I'm just curious. So, there are many places where religion is favorably or all religions are not seen equally. So how do you implement religion for peace in those places?
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Azza, the floor is yours. Then we will take a second round of questions.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for these really good questions. To speak very briefly to the question of Ahmed on the role of religious leaders on FGM, female genital mutilation, I think we all are aware of the fact that one of the key strengths that religious leaders play is they influence, they impact on ways of behavior and approaches, the decisions in life that people take. They have a tremendous impact, no matter how secular anybody thinks they are. And we know that 80% of the world's people have a certain affiliation to religion or to faith. So secularism perhaps may be the purview of Western European countries, but it is definitely not the reality in most parts of the world, and certainly not from the parts of the world that we all come from. So we know that religious leaders have a huge impact in this space, and there are plenty of studies that the UN and other institutions and international NGOs and national and local NGOs have provided that actually trace the impact of having religious leaders advocate against FGM, very openly, publicly, in different ways, advocating against FGM, and the declining rate of the practice of FGM as a result, if you will, of this very critical advocacy that religious leaders play. There are enough studies that show the correlation between how it is that when religious leaders openly and publicly and clearly speak out against FGM, that this actually leads to a diminishing of the practice of this. The challenge is not so much in the fact that you have religious leaders who speak out against it. The challenge is that you sometimes have religious leaders, especially at the very micro community level in more rural settings, where you have religious leaders and all it takes is a couple who will speak for it, who will advocate for it. Now, unfortunately, the impact of the two, for instance, in a particular set of villages in any particular country who are speaking for FGM, the impact can be very, very big as well. So how do we make sure that every single religious leader sees FGM and harmful practices in general, such as early and child marriage? How can we make sure that every single one of these religious leaders is educated to understand that this is a harmful set of practices? This is the challenge. This is a challenge, not because it's difficult to reach every single religious leader. Of course, it is difficult to reach every single religious leader. You can't. It's like trying to reach every single human being. But the challenge is also that sometimes these issues, like FGM, like early child marriage, sometimes these issues are considered very political. Sometimes certain government leaders want to make friends with political actors because they need them as their allies. When that alliance happens, if the religious actors are enlightened people, then the alliance with the politicians is probably a good thing, because it means that that particularly enlightened philosophy will become more interesting and more normal for this political leader. But when and where this religious political alliance happens with a religious institution or religious actors who are not necessarily, how shall I say it to be diplomatic and polite, who are not necessarily very aware of human rights, who are not necessarily very keen on all aspects of human rights, when the alliance between those kinds of religious leaders and political leaders happens, then that usually will translate into a very bad time indeed for human rights related issues, of which FGM is one. So because the political plays a role, unfortunately, and increasingly is playing a role, and this takes us to the question that I heard, I believe it was from you, Adina, who said, well, we're looking at some of this really white supremacist, right-wing extremist ideologies that are coming out in this situation of disaster and conflict. Yes, we are hearing a lot of religiously sanctioned exclusivist discourse and actions. We are hearing a lot of religious leaders, unfortunately. And remember, I said it doesn't take that many. It doesn't take that many to cause a lot of harm, because people are listening. So yes, we are seeing that increase, because one of the things that this COVID disaster has caused all of us is a heightened fear. Whenever we are so afraid, whenever we are so uncertain, we are so afraid. Whenever we are so afraid, we're not necessarily terribly rational and reasonable in the way that we behave. When people are afraid, we become very primal and primitive, and we start holding on to things that give us a sense of comfort. Now, we are fortunate and blessed. Can you hear me? Okay. So we're kind of lucky if in these times of crisis and heightened fear, we can hear from the enlightened leadership, political, religious, cultural, social, financial, but especially religious. We're very fortunate if the religious leadership that we are listening to is a very enlightened form of religious leadership. Unfortunately, you can't decide, right? We really can't decide. We don't know who's going to come and speak, and we don't know how many people they will influence. So we are seeing an increase in exclusivist, marginalizing, discriminatory rhetoric. And yes, some of it is religiously backed. If you've been following events in the United States these days, you will notice that there's a massive set of, there's huge anger against discriminatory rhetoric. And unfortunately, sometimes this discriminatory rhetoric is espoused, is spoken by religious leaders. Religious leaders are as diverse as we are. Some of us are going to be attracted to neo-Nazi thinking. Some of us are going to be attracted to spirituality and Sufism and whatever. And then there's many shades in between. Religious leaders and religious actors are like that too. They're human beings too. Some of them are attracted by not so nice ways of thinking, and some of them are amazingly enlightened beings, and everything in between. So the issue here is not that we would what we would expect, as I was sharing with you earlier. The challenge is that I noticed that even though I expected the religious actors to come together and want to work together and to serve one another, and I realized that's not what's happening. What's happening in the name of service is that everybody's working in their own community, in their own space, in their own organization. So this means that we will find people who are more comfortable with exclusivist and discriminatory narrative and realities. They are also there working in their own spaces. The challenge, therefore, demands that we not expect everybody to become an agent of goodness, but we ourselves have to continue being the conscience of all of our leadership, religious, political, social, cultural, economic, you name it. Here, the point is there are so many religious institutions who are working together. And that's why interreligious or multi-religious hubs are so critical. Because per definition, the religious actors, when they do come together, they come together for good. They don't come together for harm. They actually come together for good. When they come together across their diversities, the Hindu, the Buddhist, the Muslim, the Christian, when they come together, 99.9% of the time, they're coming together for good, for the common good. That's what brought them together. So the multi-religious spaces today are necessary in the same way that oxygen is necessary for us to breathe. The multi-religious spaces today are the spaces where we will find the right kind of narratives, the goodness, the peace in and out. And that's why they're so important today. And that's the answer, I think, to Adina, what you were saying in terms of what can you do to counter. You come together across your religious differences. You come together for the common good. You come together for goodness, like you're seeing happen here in the United States with the demonstrations. It doesn't matter whether you're Muslim or Christian or Hindu or Jewish or Buddhist or of no faith whatsoever. You're coming together because you're against discrimination. You're for justice. When you come together across your differences, in 99.99% of the cases, you're coming together for the social good. So the coming together, the multi-religious today is absolutely quintessential. This also addresses the question that Hussein said, what happens in countries where religions are not seen equally? Hussein, when they come together as religious leaders and religious institutions, they come together as equals. Otherwise, they wouldn't come together. So those interreligious or multi-religious spaces become very necessary and are very necessary and have served to ensure that there is no majority minority. There is no one religion better than the other. In the councils, in the 90 interreligious councils that Religions for Peace has created over 50 years, in 90 countries, they come together as equals. It's not that you have a bigger amount of Muslim or Christian because they're more majority Muslims. No, they're coming together as faith leaders, as equals. That platform of equality between them makes a very big difference in the eyes of their community, the message that they're sharing. It is saying to the politicians, just as it is saying to the average man on the street, we are people of faith, regardless of whether we are majorities or minorities. We are people of faith, we're leaders of faith, we come together as leaders of faith. There is no distinction and discrimination between us. Therefore, there should be no distinction and discrimination between you. Interreligious structures, interreligious activity is as integral to our existence in this world as oxygen is for us to breathe. It's just a fact, but nobody's going to speak about it because everybody's much more comfortable speaking about their own and the supremacy of their own faith and their own religious tradition and their own religious leaders and their own religious institutions. Let's face it, we discriminate between religions. Even as citizens who don't have religions, we discriminate between religions.
So how valuable then is it to insist on the multi-religious spaces that clarify to all, through their existence, through their activity, that we are all human beings in the eyes of whatever divine there is? Absolutely critical.
Thank you very much, Dr. Azza. And mashallah, you have a lot of questions. I will, for the participants, please allow me to do some selection where I can try to make the balance between our OIC regions and non-OIC regions as well. But inshallah, we'll try to cover all the questions. We will start with Fahrulia Rahmania Farid from Indonesia. Go ahead and be please quick. We want quick questions, please. Go ahead.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Farah from Indonesia. Beforehand, I greatly appreciate the talk, ma'am. It is very meaningful. And children are vulnerable in receiving ideology without knowing whether it is good or bad. And that is a threat. And interracial communities are seen as a threat in some countries. And as a youth and as a student, what are the steps in starting to open the eyes of the society to start to educate people that interracial communities are important? Thank you.
Second, thank you very much. Second question is by Basira Bayram from Afghanistan.
Hello, dear all. This is Basira Bayram from Afghanistan.
Welcome.
I have two questions. Firstly, the question refers to the crisis conflicts in Islamic countries, especially during Ramadan month. Unfortunately, there were huge conflicts, huge security crisis in Afghanistan. It increased, unfortunately, but there were not any strong speech or strong strong declaration by Islamic aliens or Islamic countries, Islamic organizations, regional or international. I'm asking the question, what could be the specific duty of Islamic cooperative organization in this regard, that the crisis, especially security crisis, is increasing day by day in Islamic countries like Afghanistan, Yemen, or Syria, increasing day by day. Even in COVID-19, yeah, COVID-19. COVID-19 also it's also a huge negative impact on people's life. But beside that, the security crisis is increasing in Islamic countries. The second question is wrong information by religious leaders or religious people who are just khatib in mosque. They are speaking to the people, they are giving Islam religion to the people. They have provided wrong information to the people. Even they invited people to gather in mosque during COVID-19. This is also one of the reasons why Afghanistan, Pakistan, or Iran faced to a lot of challenges and couldn't control, even yet haven't controlled on COVID-19. What would be the international or regional Islamic cooperative organizations' position or for stopping this kind of crisis among Islamic countries?
Thank you very much, Basira. I believe Dr. Azza will direct you to the right channels to ask these questions, because you're asking about the role of Islamic cooperation. Dr. Azza is speaking about religions of peace, but I'm sure she will share some of her wisdom with you. I will take the next question from Tufail Abdul Kam from Nigeria. Please, the floor is yours. Please be precise and direct and make a quick questions. We have a lot of people, they have lots of questions. Let's be generous with others.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
I am Tufail from Nigeria, and I want to ask the guest speaker of the day a question that is critical to the security challenge in Nigeria. For over 10 years in Nigeria, we've been faced with the challenge of Boko Haram, and up till now, we are still facing this same security challenge. We expend a lot of our budgets in getting security architecture that will be used in expanding this particular crisis, but we've not seen results so far. I believe in the fact that we have to deploy the religious institution in tackling these basic challenges of security challenge in Nigeria. I want to ask the guest speaker a question that in the midst of these security challenges, how do you believe the religious institution can play their own roles in addressing the roots of this crisis? Thank you very much.
Last question I will take, and then maybe the floor to Dr. Azza, is Farah Salama from Jordan. Please, the floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum. It's Farah Salama from Jordan. It's just a small question that I think that many of helping now in the whole world, just focusing on the really necessary things for the people, just food and this kind of stuff. And I know it's really important, but I think that we need to think in a bigger, a little bit of strategic to things that help people to help themselves for a long time. And I think there's a lot of spending on a logistic thing. So is that our youth point of view, or you can see this too as an expert in this thing? And thank you so much.
You're welcome. Please, Dr. Azza, the floor is yours.
So first of all, thank you very much again for another brilliant set of questions. I think I'd like to be able to start with the last one from Farah first, which is to say, yes, you're absolutely correct that there are two kinds of emphasis that is taking place now. One is on saving lives and what that's going to require. The other, I'm sorry to say, is on making money. Right? So the good news is that there are attempts to try to see how to make money and keep things going, usually businesses and governments. So that's the good news. The bad news is that those who are able to in a sense make most money are usually the ones who are already doing very well. Thank you very much. Already they're doing very well. They're the corporations, the businesses they were not wanting. They were not in a desperate need before this whole hullabaloo happened. So now they are doing very well. Thank you, because they're busy trying to find medication or trying to find windows of opportunity to resource their respective efforts. So then the question becomes, what is the role of, if you will, the charity sector, the ones who have been serving, the ones, the religious and otherwise, and this is where usually the help comes from, right? So the government is doing it in most cases. Most governments are absolutely doing their best because they have no choice, quite frankly. It has nothing to do with whether they are democratically elected or not. Their governments have to save their people. This is it. So the governments are doing their best to try to satisfy the demand of those multitudes, literally, of hungry people who have no food, let alone medicine, let alone shelter. I mean, khalas, they have nothing. So as the governments serve in this particular space to try to save lives, so do the other charity institutions, religious and otherwise. There are already, within these different religious charity and others, there have been initiatives to try to enable people to have an income, stand on their own 2 feet, etc. The problem is that many of these initiatives took a bit of a dive. They had to stop, especially things that required direct going out and meeting and carrying and so on. Some of it stopped, but not all of it stopped. So for instance, if you look at something very basic, when like the production of masks, there was a time, if you remember, not so long ago, where there was an international shortage of masks. The people didn't have masks. So the production of masks then went and became part of what different women, usually women-run households, were anyway doing. They were producing masks, and young people were getting involved, and so on. And so here's a sector that actually is intended for the life-saving part, but is also an income-generating part.
So those kinds of sectors are still actually going pretty well now because people need certain things and they have to be provided. But there is a situation where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, for sure. That's what this particular crisis has enabled. One of the reasons why we're saying in Religions for Peace, we're saying you need to work together. Doesn't matter if you're Catholic or Protestant or Hindu or Judaism, you need to work together. It's because you will be able to identify some of these programs and initiatives that you can support together to ensure that there's no downward curve. Right? That's the whole deal, is you get more information, you get to know who's suffering more, you get to know what is working better if you're able to exchange that information and that knowledge by working together. That's why we're insisting, please go together. And that logic, by the way, is precisely what, to a large extent, is also a response to what Basira and Fahrulia were referring to. Now, Basira, to be honest with you, the questions that you asked are brilliant questions as well. They really should be asked to Dr. Fadila Grain, because she's working in that space of organizations of Islamic governments and communities. That really is her kind of question to answer. So I'm not going to dwell too much on it. I am going to share with you that the fact that we had religious leaders, not just Muslim, by the way, Christian and Hindu and Jewish, there were many who insisted that in spite of the guidelines, they must congregate in their respective religious institutions, that the mosques had to remain open, that the churches had to, there were. It was a big problem. It is a big problem because not only is this incredibly medically unsafe and therefore endangers lives, it's also in a way a protest against the government ruled health guidelines. So it's socially problematic, it's medically problematic, it's politically problematic. There were. Now the question here is this: would it have helped if the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the United Nations in all its glory had issued statements to say, please don't do that? Well, it didn't help because they did. Because these global corporations, these global institutions did issue the guidelines very clearly, and they went everywhere. And so it wasn't about a lack of knowledge. It wasn't about a lack of information only. It was also about not believing, not wanting to believe in this. It was also about a political opportunity to get some grandstanding and some influence, in spite of the fact that it was very clear that this is unsafe, that you knew it was going to be unsafe, but you didn't believe because you either really believed that God was going to protect you, no matter what you did, or you just preferred to have a moment in the limelight to say, we must mobilize, we must do this. It was a political opportunity, right? So this kind of stuff, this kind of, if you will, to put it politely, this kind of ignorant decision-making, there's nothing you can do about beyond working together. If a whole group of religious leaders in that country, and this happened in many cases, many of these interreligious councils that Religions for Peace is and runs, came out and issued very clear guidance, very clear statements, very clear health advisory notes. Do not do this. We suggest an alternative way of doing your practice. Where they were listened, they were listened. Where they were not listened to, that's a perpetual issue. But I don't think any of the international or national or regional or provincial institutions are culpable of not issuing the right kind of information and the right kind of guidance. You can't say that because everybody did issue plenty. At the end of the day, it comes down to the local religious leader and what usually he wants to believe or do. And that's hard to change every single local religious leader. And yes, Fahrulia, you're absolutely right. Again, when you come together as religious communities and you say the same thing, it's a very powerful thing. When you come together as religious actors and you uphold the very moral nature of every single child, regardless of what their interrelational or racial mix is, that's a very powerful thing to go against. When religious actors come together, they are the most powerful moral, political, cultural, economic force our lives have ever known. When religious leaders come together on human rights, they are the most powerful moral agents, political agents, economic agents of human rights. They are the most powerful. They are much more powerful than the governments. They are much more powerful than every single other NGO. When religious institutions come together to defend human rights will be defended. Coming together is critical. Again, we need our religious actors and institutions to come together on human rights exactly the same way we need the oxygen that we breathe. Because that is the most powerful defense that there is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Azza, for this wonderful elaboration. I would like to take one recent question because I believe some of our participants cannot access the camera and the microphone, so we will be fair to them. So I'll take from Summer Zikri from Tunisia. She said, in our society, the word of religious organization has become a little bit scaring, unfortunately, because of Islamophobia. So how can we make people accept it and be attracted to it? Then I'll give the floor to Zulaykho Ilmatova from Uzbekistan, I believe. The floor is yours. Zulaykho Ilmatova from Uzbekistan. Or if she's not available, I will give to Fadil Olmihanik from Bosnia. Fadil from Bosnia.
All right, thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for this amazing presentation. I love the way you presented it. It was really passionate. I love the way you presented it as well. I'm coming from Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is a country in Europe. And quite recently, 25 years ago, we've went out of a conflict where Muslims were attacked by, one group of people were attacked by another. And I believe both of these organizations are a part of the Organization Religions for Peace. So my question is, when there is an open conflict and when it's obvious that one group of people is doing crimes and genocide over another, is there a way that the Organization Religions for Peace can sanction the one doing these crimes? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me take back Fahri, what's her name? From Uzbekistan, because she couldn't come and now she's back. Can we take her, please? Okay. Otherwise, I'll go to Akil Khan Kalimaiza from Kazakhstan. We're trying really to take everybody on board, at least keeping the balance between the regions.
Mm-hmm.
Is not possible, then please can you move to Ahmed Ben from Morocco. Moderator, please, technical moderator, I am asking for Ahmed from Morocco. Ahmed Ben from Morocco. Okay, looks like this is not also possible.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, sure, go ahead, please.
Sorry, but I think that I didn't raise my hand, but I'm going to take this opportunity.
No, it was raised for me. So if you don't want to take the question, no problem. We have plenty of questions out there, no problem.
Okay, I will.
Go ahead. If you have a question, go ahead. Quickly, please.
I'd just like to thank our guest today. I really enjoyed her speech. It's powerful and full of emotional motivation. My question is about in the context of this problem, or the international context of what is happening these days in America. What is our guest's view on this subject?
Thank you. Dr. Azza, would you like me to take one or two more questions?
Sure.
Or you want to answer?
No,
yes.
no, go ahead.
Okay, Zulaykho Ilmatova from Uzbekistan, are you ready now?
From Nigeria here.
Please go ahead. Zulaykho, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. We now see that there are now social and religious conflicts among countries, and my question is this your organization, or are there some such sort of organizations to deal with such issues? For example, in China, we see a lot of conflicts among Muslim people and others. So my question is this.
Sorry, I didn't get the question. The question is
Can
what
you say
exactly?
it again, please? Yeah.
Nowadays, we can see social and religious conflicts among nations. For example, in China, we can see such discriminations and a lot of attacks. I saw them on social networks. So my question is, are there any organizations to deal with such issues?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can we take Marwa Humeida from Algeria? Marwa Humeida from Algeria.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Go ahead, please.
My question is, what kind of change that the Organization of Religious for Peace is tended to make in the post-COVID-19, and because of some things we have noticed in the COVID-19 crisis?
Okay, last question, and I give you, thank you very much, Marwa. I take the question from Sidi Kamara from Mali, and then I give the floor to Dr. Azza. Sidi Kamara from Mali.
Yes, I'm here.
Please
Assalamu
go ahead.
alaikum. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Thanks a lot to Dr. Azza for this amazing speech. And I found out that one of your organization's 6 strategic priority is gender equality. And there is always a debate between the team who defend idea of gender equality and who see the opposite. I'm confused other times about this meaning. Does equality mean justice in right, or means that women has to be like men in all matters? This is my question.
Thank you very much. Dr. Azza, the floor is yours. I have lots of other questions. It's up to you if you want me to take more. Go ahead, please.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for your questions. I've also, by the way, been trying to answer some on the chat, just so that some of you do get a couple of answers in case we are not able to be heard. But thank you very much, Dr. Fadila, also for managing the question. I know it's not easy. Maybe just begin very quickly with the question that was asked about what is Religions for Peace doing to face the humanitarian crisis. I gave a whole presentation about that in the beginning. I would hope that you would all have access to the PowerPoint presentation, so then you will be able to see. But also, quite frankly, if you just check our website, there's plenty. There's a whole site on the COVID-19 hub and the responses that Religions for Peace is doing, not only globally, but also regionally and nationally. So I would urge you to please check that out, because you'll find some answers to your very important questions. In terms of the question about Islamophobia, by the way, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, all forms of religious phobia are absolutely unacceptable. What is it that we can do about them? Well, we can do you know what? The answer is really extraordinarily simple. But it was, I believe, Einstein who said that genius is in recognizing the obvious. It's not this complicated, complex. It's in recognizing the obvious. The obvious, by the way, is that when we work with each other, for one another, caring for one another, regardless of the color of our skin, of our gender, of our nation, of our religion, when we identify as human beings with common needs, because the same blood runs through all of us, when we come across that amazing realization that the divine in all his or its glory has created us diverse for probably a really wise reason, because it would not have been very difficult for God to create us all alike. I shouldn't think that would have been too complicated. There's a reason we're created diverse, because that diversity is our humanity. The diversity is our humanity. So if we acknowledge that humanity and work with one another, for one another, guess what? The likelihood of a whole bunch of prejudices and discrimination will have no foundation anymore. It simply will have no foundation anymore. Because unless, of course, we all run around hating ourselves, in which case, yes, of course, we hate the other person in front of us too, because they're black, because they're blue, because they're yellow, because they're whatever. But the fact of the matter is that the divine created us diverse. So when we work with and for one another,
the likelihood of our ability to discriminate, to hurt ourselves in the other, is very, very reduced, to put it mildly. Islamophobia is politically induced in as much as it is a feature of ignorance. It is politically induced. But we participate in that process of political inducement because of many reasons. We partake of that process of political inducement. Our governments partake of it. Our self-interest partakes of it. It takes two for hatred to happen. If one person is going around hating everybody in the world, that's not enough. That's not enough to cause a disaster. What causes a disaster is when that person finds a counterpart or multiple counterparts. Then the hatred starts. Islamophobia and anti-Semitism can only be combated by being together, working together, by speaking together. Some of the most powerful moments in countering Islamophobia and anti-Semitism is when Muslim leaders stand up to argue against anti-Semitism and to actively say this is wrong. Is when Jewish leaders stand up to argue against Islamophobia and to say and to maintain that this is wrong. Those are moments of extreme power. Those are moments where it is extraordinarily difficult to push forward an Islamophobic or any religiously antagonistic discourse, when other religious actors stand up to defend one another. When the Jewish and Christian community surrounded the mosques after 9/11 here in the United States to protect them while the prayers were taking place, powerful moment. Impossible to maintain that Islamophobic feeling when you realize that the Christians and the Jews and the Hindus and the Sikhs and the Buddhists are actually protecting the Muslims, and vice versa. When the Muslims stand up to protect their brethren, whether they are Hindu or Buddhist or Jewish, when we stand up to protect one another as people of faith, no religious discrimination is possible. Because then who's discriminating? Those who will have to fight us. Because I will stand by you regardless of your religion. Then I too will either be hurt by you or for you. Either way, there's no room for hate. Hate is defeated, whatever its nature and whatever its shape. We have lost that sense of commitment to one another, regardless of our differences. We have emphasized, and unfortunately, the COVID crisis that is global in nature has forced even more to emphasize the differences, has forced even more boundaries, even more borders between us. Unfortunately, COVID has done that. And as long as that is the case, we take responsibility. We must take responsibility for the hatred that happens in each other's names, whatever the name of that hatred is, religious, gender, social, whatever. And that's what will ultimately, to answer the question of our colleague from Bosnia, ultimately, at the end of the day, the Interreligious Council of Bosnia was established. By the way, it's one of our flagship councils. I believe it was established by a group of religious leaders. Your former Mufti, Dr. Mustafa Ceric, played a very strong role in bringing together the religious leaders across Bosnia-Herzegovina to establish an interreligious council for one purpose and one purpose only: to stop the hate, to stop the pain, to deal with the resentment, to work together, but work together. Because he alone and the entire Muslim community alone could not heal the wound, could not stop the wound and the wounding. But when they came together, they began to heal together. And that, again, together is our oxygen. That's the oxygen. Religions for Peace cannot sanction. We can speak out as one. And if you look at our website, you will see that our religious leaders have come together to speak out as one against every single form of discrimination and injustice and wrong that happens. We can speak out as one, powerfully as one. But in a context where governments are the ultimate decision makers, religious actors have a role to play, but they cannot be relied upon to do everything. Please don't rely on religious actors to do everything. I'm telling you this. I am heading a religious organization. I'm telling you, please do not rely on religious actors to do everything. That's not the point. The point is to be able to get the religions to work together, people of faith to come together. But don't rely on religious institutions to serve and to solve all problems. That's not the right thing either. The point is we have civic organizations, political, social, cultural, economic, and religious. And we need to make sure that the religious actors are part of the civic fabric of every society. civic, not political. Because history has shown us that when religions get into politics, it's not good. It's never been good, actually. So we, as people of faith, we see our institutions, our religious institutions. They represent our faith, supposedly. We make them accountable to us as people of faith because we are their adherents. They are nothing without us. We must make these institutions of faith accountable to the basic goodness of their teachings. We must help bring them together. That's what my job in this organization with my colleagues around the world is. We come together. We come together not because we are the supreme council of everybody. No, we come together because as people of faith, when we come together, we are a powerful force to be reckoned with. We are a powerful civic force to be reckoned with. We are part of a civic infrastructure. And the minute that we can come together to be part of a civic infrastructure is the minute that our power expands. Because then we are civilians working in a civic society space, which is now deeply, deeply oppressed in most parts of the world, including the country I'm in right now, which is the United States of America. Look around you. Look around you. We have a moment where civic freedom is threatened. Every single form of civic freedom is threatened. In every country around the world, there is no safe civic space anymore, believe it or not. And COVID has made that even more urgent, even more pressing. Religious actors are civic actors. When religious actors come together, that's like a massive block in a community that comes together. They are powerful together, but they are even more powerful when they come together with other civic actors. That is the power of our civic humanity. And that's why it's important for us to think in those terms, not to think that the religions are going to solve everything. They will not solve everything. Why? Since when? But when the civic space is a space of protection of one another without discrimination, when the civic space is a space where the Muslim and the Jew and the Hindu and the Buddhist and the non-religious come together to stand to protect one another, when that principle happens, that's when our civic space is protected. That's when governments start to pay attention. And until then, they can do what they want. They are doing what they want, pretty much. So the only way to sanction is us. As civilians, we sanction or we don't, or we partake. We participate or we sanction. We sanction through our behavior. We sanction through the way that we think. We sanction through the way that we hold our hands together or not. That's the sanction. And that's my view on what's happening in the United States. In the United States today, we are talking about a particular administration that has made it very, very difficult for the civic voices of protest, for the voices to be heard. There's a leadership that has not necessarily had the popular vote. And when that happens, things usually tend to be extraordinarily complicated. Racism is what people refer to as the original sin of American society. And it has never been dealt with because, like many other things just go under the carpet. We have a tendency, all of us as human beings, to prefer not to deal with certain difficult situations, especially if we're male. Sorry, but it's the truth. Women are often accused of being too emotional, too passionate, too this, too that. Well, yeah, because we also happen to want to deal with problems and unpack them most of the time. And we, in trying to unpack, there's another approach. There's one approach that says, let's unpack, let's analyze, let's investigate, let's come up with, and there's another approach that says, look, we're done, we're finished, move that away, let's focus on the present, let's be rational, let's be reasonable. Great. We've been using the reasonable, rational approach for a very long time, for the last maybe 75, 80 years of human history. We've been very rational. And look at what's happened. Clearly, having a little bit of emotion, there's also something called emotional intelligence. Clearly, having a little bit of emotional intelligence probably is not likely to get us in any worse situations than where the whole world is right now. Probably likely to help. We can at least give it a try. At a minimum, let's give emotional intelligence a try. Let's see what it's like when men and women work together. Gender equality is about access to opportunities, is about equal access to resources and opportunities. There is no religious or other law in humanity that says that a man or a boy should have more access to God's mercy than a woman or a girl. There is no such law because God is merciful towards all. The Creator is merciful towards all. It's human beings who are often not very merciful towards all. Gender equality is a very fundamental, actually, if you think about it, a very spiritual principle. It's about making sure that everybody has access to mercy. Mercy in the form of opportunities, mercy in the form of resources, mercy in the form of the chance to speak, to serve, to be the leader of all. Mercy can take many forms. Gender equality actually says you have no right to restrict access to resources and opportunities to anybody. Gender equality is not the same as women's empowerment. Women's empowerment says, yes, you cannot restrict access to opportunities and resources to females. But gender equality tells you something else. It tells you you cannot restrict access to God's mercy, i.e. opportunities and resources. You cannot restrict that based on a person's gender identity. Gender equality is a heck of a lot more powerful here because it's about all forms of gender. And let's face it, there are multiple. And gender equality says access to opportunity and resources for all. It's the foundational human rights principle. That's what gender equality actually says. You don't discriminate. Not some group, some people, men or others are not entitled to what others are not. We're all entitled to the access as different genders. We're entitled to accessing the same opportunities and the same resources because we're human beings. Ultimately, because we're human beings. So don't discriminate against me based on gender, on my gender, but don't discriminate against me based on my race or my ethnicity or my language or anything else. Gender equality is about not discriminating against me based on my gender identity. It's as simple as that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Azza. I will have to take the last round of questions, which is actually so many questions out there. I am very, very sorry for our participants. I really tried our best to answer your questions, but we couldn't take all, so please forgive us for not taking all of you. I will take Mendeg from Djibouti. Then after him right away, it would be Maha from Morocco, and then I will take a few more. Dr. Azza, please bear with us. You have been giving a lot of energy today, but it's all rewarding and it will give a lot of impact. You're talking to the right people. Mendeg from Djibouti, please. Be specific, be quick, please. Our dear participants, we need to give the chance to many. Mendeg?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Can you put the camera off? Maybe that will help to make your voice clearer.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very, very appreciated. My question is very quick. What is your call to action? And how can we efficiently use social media to empower ourselves and to raise awareness? Thank you again for your presentation, and I appreciate it.
Maha, thank you. Maha from Morocco, quick question, please.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ashatma. I'm 19 years old from Morocco. I want to ask my doctor about the peace. I know that the peace is the best solution, but we have some people who present the religion in the fake image. That's why the people, all the people believe that the true image for each religion, like Islam, they believe that the terrorist is related with Islam, and they give some arguments from the Quran by al-Jihad. So how we can achieve the peace if there are some people like that?
Okay, I will take also, thank you, Maha. I'll take Daouda Gidrago from Cote d'Ivoire. Then after him, Christopher from Nigeria.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Wa alaikum assalam.
I'm Daouda from Cote d'Ivoire. You know, I'm living in a multi-religion society. In Ivory Coast, we are around 50% of Muslims, but we live with others religion communities in a peaceful atmosphere. So my question is to know how to do with my, what is my question? Excuse me, I note my question somewhere.
Okay.
So my question is, as youth, I'm not an English speaker, so
it's okay. Go ahead. Go ahead. No problem.
As youth, what can we do locally to promote the inter-religion movement?
Thank you. I'll take Christopher. Christopher, please go ahead from Nigeria or Ethiopia. I can't see the country. It's Christopher Amrobo.
Thank you very much, everyone. And specifically, thank you, Professor, for the lecture so far. I would like to put in something more or less like a suggestion to some of the
we can't hear you. Can you put the camera off so your voice will be clear? Put the camera off, please. Can you put your camera off? Okay, it's frozen. I'll take Mahmoud Omar from Somalia.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
I'm Mahmoud Omar Haji from Somalia, and I'm thanking to the professor. And I want to ask a question. And Professor, you said that Religious for Peace is working with religious leaders and religious institutions. So my question is, are those religious leaders and religious institutions representative from their countries? If it is yes, the Somalia member of those religious institutions and religious and leaders?
Okay, thank you very much. Last question for this round of questions is from Amsiar Ahmed from Malaysia.
Bismillah, Assalamualaikum. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for this
Khabar?
opportunity.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Alhamdulillah. Marhaba. Okay, so my question. Thank you so much to Dr. Azam Karam for this particular amazing presentation. I'm attracted with your points on how to curb the Islamophobia around the world, alongside on how can we help each other regardless of religion. So in general, in Malaysia, we do have multi-religious communities. And my question is, although similar to our sister Mandek from Djibouti, of call for action that can be done by Muslim youth on how can we promote Islam as the way of life, as the rahmat lil alamin, the mercy to all creatures in the world. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Azza, the virtual floor is yours for the final round of questions.
Thank you very much indeed. Again, another round of excellent questions. Thank you. You actually really honor me with your questions, so I'm grateful to you for that. Forgive me if I've misunderstood any of your questions, but I'm going to do my best to try to respond one by one. So there was a very first question about what is my call to action, or what is our Religions for Peace's call to action, and how can we use social media
to support that. To be really honest, the call to action I've made about 5 or 6 times already, which is work together regardless of your religious differences. Work together for the same. If this is the moment in time when we are all confronted with exactly the same crisis. We're all confronted with exactly the same crisis. It's called COVID-19. This is the moment to come and work together. My call to action, if ever there would be one, is come together across your religious differences, across your ethnic, your racial, your gender differences. Come together, work together, because that's an incredibly powerful way of surviving where we are right now. We don't have an option of each one of us going and hiding behind the 4 walls of their homes if we're lucky enough to have a home, or the 2 parts of their tents if we're living as refugees and migrants. This is not a moment to hide. This is not a moment to believe that we are better than anybody else. This is the moment to come and work together. My call to action is come and work together. You, the young people of the world, are the ones I look to see how to use social media. I don't do social media very well because I'm a dinosaur a dinosaur generation that is still trying to figure out how to work this Zoom thing that we're talking with one another. So frankly, I'm not the best person to ask about how you use social media. I do think of one thing though. I do marvel at the fact that social media can be a means of finding out so much information. Yami, so much information you can find in social media. You can even find out how to build a bomb through social media. So are you trying to tell me that you can't think of a way to use social media to encourage one another to work across one another? Why? How do we think the Arab Spring happened when it was a spring? Not now when it's the dearth of winter. The Arab Spring happened because people came together across social media. They called one another. They used social media to do so. Call one another. Call one another to do good. Be together in doing good. What's stopping you from serving one another? The race, the color, the religion? Really? Because it means we have less blood, red blood running through our veins. The call to action is you use social media to do good, to encourage one another to do good. You're the young ones. It is to you that I look for inspiration. I want to know what I can do for you. I want to know what I can do with you. I don't have the answers. I need them from you. You're the inspiration to me and to my generation and to the older generations. It is your voice that counts. It is your voice that is my present and our future. So you tell me what you can do with one another with social media. I am listening. Yes, there are some religious leaders who do a very good job of presenting the absolute worst that there can possibly be for us as human beings. There are some very, very accomplished religious and political leaders in this space. God created them too. We have to work with those who we think want the better for all. We work together in spite of those religious leaders. We stick to our faith. We reclaim our faith in spite of those religious leaders. It's not because everybody's saying everything's good and everything's happy and everybody's happy that we will be together. It is when things are difficult. It is when things are really painful. It is when we hurt one another most that we need one another most. It's when religious leaders preach hatred that we find those who preach love and we help them magnify their voice and their impact. That is our job. We don't wait for the religious leaders to all suddenly become angels. Why would they? They're human like any of us. What we do is we find those voices that speak of the goodness, of the mercy, of the rahmah. We find those voices, we help elevate them, we articulate, we echo those voices. We act mercifully in our own lives with one another, beginning from our own families, where sometimes the most pain comes from. We act with mercy in these spaces. We act with that mercy. We become the agents of that mercy. Our politicians and religious leaders and social leaders and financial leaders will change because you will change them. They won't change because they suddenly will see the light. They will change when you change them. You exemplify the other way to be, ways to be. That is the job that you have in hand. You are waiting for some people to give you guidance. The guidance is in you. Every single one of you, the guidance is within, because God speaks to you or doesn't, as is the case. The guidance is right there. It's right there. It's not in a foreign institution. It's not in an international organization. It's not in a government. It's in you. And it's in your faith tradition if you believe. The guidance is all there. Many, many times over, the guidance is all there. How to promote the interreligious movement in the Côte d'Ivoire when there's 50%. Yeah, I mean, that you are it. You are it. Come together. Do more things together. Christian and Muslim youth, come together, do things, serve your communities right now. There is massive need right now. Find out what you can actually do together. That's how you promote interreligious cohesion. You serve together. You serve together. That's how you promote interreligious cohesion. That's how you promote peace. You serve together. Our lives are supposed to be lives of service. Every single religion demands us to be service-oriented towards one another. That is how we can be divine. The divine is in the service. We serve together. That is how we can exemplify and change and demand accountability and be responsible and be agents of peace. We serve together. You have 50%, and you live together well? Excellent. All the more reason to work together, to serve together. There's enough need. Mohammed, about Somalia. Yes, the religious leaders represent the religious institutions Let me just say, tongue in cheek, which is really trying to not be ironic, but actually being ironic. Let me just say that the religious leaders and the religious institutions are about as representative of their religious communities as the political leaders and the political institutions that we have around us today. They're about the same kind of representative. Okay? If you think that the religious institutions, if you think your religious leadership represents you, then they are represented on Religions for Peace. All the religious institutions are represented. Yes, there is, I believe, a local Somali chapter. If there isn't a local Somali chapter or affiliate of Religions for Peace, make one, build one, Mahmoud. That becomes your job. Bring the young people and the religious leaders together and build an interreligious council in Somalia. Nothing to stop you doing that. If there is one, however, do see if you can work with them and improve them. It's often much easier to try to, well, actually, that's not true. That's not true. Delete that. I didn't say that. Rewind. It is often a good idea to try to get the institutions that are present to function better. It is actually part of our obligation as citizens to try to work with the existing institutions to make them more representative, accountable, and deliver better for everybody. It is often a very good idea as citizens that we try to do that. Sometimes the existing institutions are not the best, and sometimes working within them is not enough to improve them. You need to work alongside, you need to work from outside. It's a decision we all have to make at different moments in our career. Do we work within an existing structure, or do we try to work outside of it, supportive of it, or do we try to work outside of it against it? It's a decision we all take in our entire life. I personally recommend that where you find an interreligious structure already existing, first try to see if you can work with that structure. If it doesn't work, and you've tried so many times to make it work, create your own interreligious nucleus structure. And it can be as dynamic and as creative and as innovative as you wish it to be, as long as it's multi-religious and is dedicated to serving together. You'll still perform miracles just by doing that. So try it. I think I've answered all your questions. The means, MCR, to demonstrate Rahmah lil Alameen is to work.
Thank you so much for your explanation.
Okay, dear Dr. Azza, you being the Secretary General of Religions for Peace, the good news, you will bring together so many good religious leaders who will believe in bringing people together and in the inclusiveness methodology that you introduced in your beginning of your term. We are all sure that you will do that job. This purpose, today you're talking to participants who are in a position of representing their country's simulation of OIC model, where they are decision makers. They are the decision makers of tomorrow. And we do believe that youth are really internalizing each and every breath and every word you said today. They will make use of it in their local context, in their local communities. And for that purpose, the ICYF OIC model was to educate, communicate, and provide opportunity for our young people in multilateral democracy and complex context where we can absorb the global picture of the impact of pandemic on social and humanitarian aspects. Today, Dr. Azza, you shared with us a very beautiful experience of yours. You shared with us your feelings, your insights, your understanding, your wisdom. As an ICYF team, on behalf of my team, on behalf of the president, on behalf of all the participants, I have been reading their chats. They are really thankful and they really appreciated your presentation and your talking. Even we thought it was a very lively contribution of yours, and it was a very short time thinking that we have been here for more than almost 2 hours. Mr. President of the ICYF, Mr. Taha, left for you very special, impressive comments. He was enjoying your presentation as well. So we have been learning so much from you this afternoon. We actually was a pleasure having you. It's a pleasure to be connected with a person who is effective and inclusive, and positive energy is reaching all over the world. We are also delighted we provided for you a platform to get in touch with the most wonderful people, our young people. And we look forward in the very near future to have you all in great sessions from the ICYF All of you are the messengers of good. All of you are the messengers of Rahma lil Alameen, as our friend from Malaysia said. And thank you very much again from the ICYF, dear friend, Dr. Azza. And inshallah, we look forward to have you in our platforms very soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank
you, Doctor.
Assalamu alaikum.
Bye.
Ma salama. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Assalamu alaikum.
Shukran. Ma salama. Terima kasih.